On a Saturday morning in Pennsylvania in 1971, 15-year-old Eli Mercer raised his hand and spent his savings on a rusted steel safe nobody else wanted. The auctioneer had already called it scrap, and the men at the feed mill laughed when Eli's bid reached $40. Calvin Rusk, the wealthiest agricultural buyer in the county, laughed loudest, telling everyone the boy had bought 800 pounds of junk that wouldn't make a chicken feeder. Eli didn't answer because he had noticed something beneath the rust that everyone missed. The torch cut stopped before the safe's inner chamber, and somebody had gone to extraordinary trouble to keep it sealed shut. The auction had begun before sunrise at the abandoned Harlan Feed and Machine Works, where the machinery shed still smelled faintly of diesel, grain dust, and old cutting oil despite being closed for nearly a year. Farmers from 3 townships had come looking for bargains, and the gravel yard was crowded with pickup trucks, trailers, and men walking between rows of used farm equipment while the auctioneer moved from one lot to the next. Eli Mercer had come with his grandfather, Ellis, hoping to find an inexpensive hydraulic pump for their 60-acre farm because they simply could not afford a new one at all. The Mercer farm had been squeezed hard that year. Spring rain had delayed planting, summer heat had reduced the corn yield, and their diesel tractor had developed a serious engine problem when they needed it most. Ellis had kept the machine running with parts from older models, but the repair had consumed nearly every dollar they could spare. Eli had spent the summer hauling feed, repairing fences, and cleaning equipment for neighboring farmers, saving $40 from every job, so the bills in his pocket represented months of work rather than spare change. Calvin Rusk was having a much better year. He owned a farm supply business, leased several thousand acres, and had spent the previous 18 months purchasing farmland from families struggling with equipment costs and weak crop prices. He had approached the Mercers twice about their 60 acres, offering enough money to make the decision uncomfortable without enough for Ellis to surrender the farm. Eli had noticed that Calvin never talked about land as a place where people lived and worked. He talked about acreage, drainage, access roads, and what each property could add to his operation. By late morning, the auction reached the equipment nobody wanted, and workers rolled the safe from inside the old feed mill. It was a commercial floor safe weighing roughly 800 pounds, with a badly corroded exterior, a shattered brass dial, and a blackened section where someone had attacked the steel with a cutting torch years earlier. The auctioneer explained that nobody had managed to open it, then joked that whoever bought it would make more money selling the steel by weight. Several men laughed, and Calvin called that the safe might make a fine chicken feeder if anybody could move it. Eli walked closer because the torch cut bothered him. The damage wasn't random. The cut had been started where the outer steel was relatively thin, but it stopped several inches before reaching the center of the door, while the metal around the opening showed a heat pattern unlike the factory welds along the safe seams. Eli crouched beside it and studied the exposed layers, remembering what Ellis had taught him about metalwork and how heat leaves evidence. He couldn't see through the steel, but he knew the torch had not reached the inner compartment, making the story of an ordinary failed robbery difficult to believe. When the auctioneer opened the bidding at $5, nobody immediately answered, and Eli eventually raised his hand. The price climbed through $10, $15, and $25 as several men watched him with amused expressions, while Calvin laughed and asked whether the boy was planning to start a museum. Eli kept bidding until the price reached $40, then raised his hand once more and spent almost everything he had saved. The auctioneer looked around for another bidder, found none, and sold the safe to Eli as laughter moved through the crowd again. Eli and Ellis loaded the 800-pound safe onto their truck with the auction yard's chain hoist, and Eli remained quiet during the drive home until his grandfather asked what he thought he had bought. Eli admitted that he didn't know what was inside, but he kept thinking about the person who had tried to cut through the steel and then stopped before reaching the chamber. Ellis studied the boy before telling him that if the $40 had bought nothing more than rust, they would find that out honestly, but if Eli's observation was right, they had purchased a mystery worth opening. That evening, they moved the safe into the barn and began scraping away decades of rust from the damaged corner. The more steel they exposed, the less the original robbery story made sense, because the torch marks ended exactly where the outer wall met a second layer of reinforced steel. Then Ellis found a line of weld running around that inner layer, applied long after the safe was manufactured. The chamber had not merely resisted being opened. Someone had deliberately sealed it shut, and whatever they had placed behind that steel had been important enough to keep unreachable. Ellis did not let Eli attack the safe with the grinder that night. He made the boy bring a flashlight, a steel ruler, a magnet, because before they cut into 800 pounds of steel, he wanted to know exactly what they were cutting. Older commercial safes were often built with multiple layers of steel separated by fire-resistant material, and that mattered because heat could destroy paper, photographs, deeds, or records long before a torch reached the center. If the hidden chamber contained something important, careless cutting could destroy the very thing they had spent $40 to investigate. Eli measured the damaged section while Ellis studied the seams under the flashlight. The factory welds were broad and regular, while the later weld was narrower, rougher, and slightly raised from the surrounding metal. Even after decades of corrosion, the steel around that repair still showed faint heat discoloration. Ellis explained that heated steel could change from straw-colored to blue or gray depending on temperature and cooling, and the pattern still showed that the repair had happened separately from the safe's original construction. They worked around the damaged side, comparing seams and marking differences with chalk. The torch attack had started on the outer wall, but stopped before reaching the reinforced compartment. The later weld had then been placed around that intersection. That meant the safe had experienced two separate events. Someone had tried to get inside, failed, and afterwards someone else had deliberately made the interior even harder to reach. Moving the safe deeper into the barn took most of the following afternoon. Without a forklift, Ellis and Eli slid steel rollers beneath the base, attached a heavy chain to the frame, and used an old overhead hoist to move it a few inches at a time. Eli guided the safe with a pry bar while Ellis watched the rollers and chain. By the time they reached the workbench, Eli's shoulders ached and his palms were red, but the safe was finally positioned securely on the concrete floor. Ellis laid out the cutting lines and deliberately avoided the original factory seams. He chose the later welded section because it was the part most likely to reveal how the hidden compartment had been constructed. He also insisted that Eli understand one thing before touching the grinder. Cutting steel was not simply a matter of making sparks until something opened. The angle of the wheel mattered, the pressure mattered, and most importantly, the heat mattered. If the chamber held old documents, excessive heat could ruin them even if the steel itself survived. Eli began the first cut while Ellis stood beside him with a fire extinguisher and wet rags. The grinder screamed against the steel, sending sparks across the concrete floor and filling the barn with the sharp smell of hot metal. Vibration traveled through Eli's wrists and into his elbows, and the cutting wheel became smaller with every pass. They stopped repeatedly to cool the metal, wiping the cut with wet rags before allowing Eli to continue. The first evening produced little more than a narrow groove. The second took them deeper, but the hardened steel consumed 3 cutting wheels and left Eli's forearms trembling when he finally set the grinder down. Ellis inspected the opening with a flashlight and found another layer behind it. The discovery confirmed what their measurements had suggested. The safe had not simply been damaged by an old robbery. It had been modified afterward. On the third evening, the grinder finally broke through the inner wall. Eli expected money, jewelry, or some obvious prize, but the space behind the steel appeared empty. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Eli began wondering whether the auction crowd had been right after all. Then he remembered the strange heat pattern. He picked up a small machinist's hammer and tapped along the rear wall. Most of the steel answered with a sharp metallic ring, but when Eli reached the lower corner, the sound changed. It was duller and shorter, as though something behind the wall was absorbing the impact. He tapped the same spot twice more, and Ellis immediately brought over the chalk. They marked the corner and cut again, this time removing only a small section at a time. Behind the steel was a narrow cavity containing a smaller black document box wrapped in oilcloth. Unlike the safe, the box opened easily. Inside were brittle photographs, handwritten maintenance records, receipts from the 1920s, and several folded property surveys. Beneath the papers rested a heavy iron object that Eli initially assumed was an old machinery part. Then Ellis unfolded the largest survey across the workbench. The map showed the Harlan Feed and Machine Works near the center of the valley, surrounded by farms, pasture boundaries, and a narrow spring-fed water channel. The channel crossed several properties before joining the creek along the lower edge of the Mercer farm. Eli recognized that creek immediately because his family still depended on it for part of their farm's water supply. Tucked beneath the survey was the iron object, an original survey marker. Beneath it sat a faded envelope containing a handwritten warning. The note explained that if anyone ever claimed the mill owned the water, the documents inside the safe were to be taken to the county. Eli read the sentence twice and then looked back at the map. Calvin Rusk had spent 18 months buying farms connected to that same water channel. Suddenly, the $40 safe looked very different. It was not protecting money at all anymore. It was protecting the history of the valley. And someone had hidden that history because they knew that one day, ownership of the water could matter more than ownership of the land. Eli and Ellis carried the documents into the farmhouse kitchen and spread them across the table beneath the yellow light above the sink, arranging the 1928 survey beside the modern county plat, then laying the maintenance records in chronological order so they could follow the changes instead of guessing at them. At first, the differences seemed ordinary enough because property boundaries had shifted over the decades as farms were divided, fences were moved, and parcels changed hands. But one discrepancy kept pulling Eli's attention back to the same line on the old survey. The original map showed the spring-fed channel running across 7 separate farms, with each property marked as having responsibility for maintaining a portion of the system, while the modern county records treated the channel as part of the former Harlan Feed and Machine Works property. The more Eli compared the two maps, the harder it became to believe that the difference was simply an old surveying error. Ellis noticed the same thing and began reading through the handwritten maintenance records that had survived inside the document box. They contained entries from the 1930s and 1940s describing spring cleanouts, drainage work, fence repairs, channel maintenance, and contributions from individual farm families, with several entries recording specific amounts of money or hours of labor contributed by each household. The records made it clear that the old feed mill had played an administrative role in maintaining the agricultural water system, but they did not describe the mill as the owner of the water. Instead, the notes repeatedly referred to the farms as members of a shared arrangement that allowed water from the spring to reach their fields and livestock. During the drought years, that system had mattered enormously because a dependable spring could mean the difference between keeping cattle alive and watching an entire pasture dry out. The problem was that several pages were missing from the records, including the section where the original arrangement appeared to have been formally documented. Without those pages, the surviving evidence was compelling but incomplete, and Ellis understood immediately that compelling was not the same thing as legally useful. He told Eli that if they wanted to challenge the modern property records, they needed more than an old map and family notes because somebody would eventually ask where the original agreement had been recorded. Eli wasn't satisfied with leaving the question unanswered, so instead of spending the afternoon speculating over the kitchen table, he put the survey into a leather folder, grabbed a measuring tape, compass, notebook, and the iron survey marker from the safe, and headed back outside. They spent the next 2 days walking the valley. Eli followed the old survey as though it were a set of instructions left behind by someone who expected him to finish the work decades later. He measured the distance between surviving fence posts, compared the angles of old stone walls with the lines drawn on the map, and used large oak trees, creek bends, and changes in elevation as reference points. Some landmarks had disappeared completely, forcing him to work backward from whatever remained, while other features were so close to the survey that he could stand in the same place the original surveyor had probably stood nearly 50 years earlier and see why the old measurements had been made the way they were. By Saturday afternoon, the investigation led Eli toward the northern edge of the valley, where blackberry vines had swallowed an abandoned fence line and young trees had grown through the spaces between the old posts. He nearly walked past a low sandstone block because only a few inches of it remained above the soil, but something about the shape caught his attention. He pulled the vines away and found a square depression carved into the top of the stone. Eli returned to the truck, brought the iron survey marker from the farmhouse, and lowered it into the depression. It fit so precisely that there was no need for further explanation. Ellis arrived carrying a shovel, and the two men cleared the ground around the stone until the shovel struck something beneath them. They worked carefully around the object and eventually uncovered a small metal survey box protected by a layer of old waterproofing material. Inside was a brass survey plate engraved with the original property measurements, including the boundaries of the shared water channel and the points where each farm had been responsible for maintenance. Ellis studied the plate for several seconds before telling Eli that they finally had something nobody could dismiss as family memory. The marker was physical evidence that the old survey had actually been established on the ground, and the measurements on the brass plate matched the document they had found inside the safe. What neither of them expected was how quickly word would travel. By Sunday morning, Calvin Rust's black pickup was sitting beside the Mercer farmhouse, and Calvin was waiting near the porch with the calm expression of a man who had already considered several possible outcomes before stepping out of his truck. He asked to see the documents, and when Ellis refused, Calvin did not become angry. Instead, he explained that old agricultural records could create confusion when people tried to apply them to modern property ownership, and he offered to purchase the documents privately so nobody would have to spend money fighting over something that might not matter. Ellis understood the offer immediately because Calvin did not ask how much the documents were worth. He asked how much Ellis needed. The distinction mattered. Calvin knew the Mercer farm was carrying debt, knew the agricultural market had been difficult, and knew that pressure could make an old piece of paper look less important than the money sitting on the table. He reminded Ellis that the future of farming was changing and suggested that holding on to outdated records would not stop larger agricultural operations from expanding across the valley. Ellis listened until Calvin finished, then told him that the documents were not for sale. Calvin nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked back to his truck without raising his voice, but Eli noticed that the calmness had disappeared from his eyes by the time he reached the driver's door. The next morning, Eli and Ellis took the original survey, brass plate, maintenance records, and the iron marker to the county clerk's office. They expected resistance, but the first setback was worse than either had anticipated. The clerk examined the documents carefully and explained that historical records did not automatically replace current property descriptions. The modern plats remained the recognized records unless the older survey could be connected to an enforceable easement or other surviving legal instrument. The clerk wasn't dismissing them. She was telling them that the evidence they had brought was not enough by itself to change anything. For the first time since opening the safe, Eli felt the excitement drain away. The safe had produced something remarkable, but remarkable did not necessarily mean powerful enough to stop Calvin's land purchases. He placed the survey back into its folder, and as he did, the paper slipped slightly and exposed the reverse side. There, almost invisible beneath years of fading, was a line of pencil writing that neither of them had noticed before. Eli tilted the page toward the window, and the words slowly became readable. The surveyor's signature followed by a short instruction identifying a duplicate filed with J. Whitaker. Ellis recognized the name immediately. John Whitaker had served as the county surveyor for decades, and although he had been gone for years, his son Henry still lived outside town. They drove there that afternoon and found Henry surrounded by filing cabinets, old field books, survey instruments, and boxes inherited from his father. When Ellis mentioned the Harlan Valley survey, Henry became quiet, then disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a long leather tube tied with faded twine. Inside was the duplicate. The measurements matched the survey from the safe, but the duplicate contained something even more important: the certification page that had disappeared from the Harlan records. It confirmed that the spring channel had been established as a shared agricultural water easement serving the 7 farms, and it carried the original surveyor's certification and filing information. Henry explained that his father had kept the duplicate because he believed someone might eventually try to simplify the old property boundaries and erase the obligations attached to them. He had worried that the original agreements would disappear simply because the people who remembered them were gone. Eli looked at the 2 surveys lying side by side and finally understood what Samuel Harlan had actually protected inside that rusted safe. He had not been hiding money, machinery contracts, or some forgotten fortune. He had been preserving evidence that could one day determine who had the right to the water flowing beneath the valley. And on Monday morning, when the county hearing opened, the dispute would no longer concern a $40 safe or one struggling farm. It would decide whether 7 farming families still possessed the water rights their land had depended on for generations. By Monday morning, the county hearing room was already crowded when Calvin Rusk arrived with 2 attorneys, polished binders, modern survey maps, and copies of the pending agricultural purchase agreements that depended on the disputed water channel. He carried himself with the same confidence he had shown at the auction, but the $40 safe had changed the nature of the argument before he ever stepped through the courthouse doors. Across the room, Ellis placed the rusted document box on the table beside the faded photographs, handwritten maintenance records, original survey, and brass survey plate that Eli had recovered from beneath the sandstone marker. The contrast was impossible to miss. Calvin had arrived with everything modern agriculture used to establish ownership, while the Mercers had brought the physical remains of an agreement that had been protecting the valley long before most of the current property lines existed. The county surveyor began by examining the original 1928 survey against the duplicate recovered from Henry Whitaker. He compared the bearings, distances, reference points, and descriptions of the spring-fed channel, then placed the modern county plat beside them. For nearly an hour, he moved between the documents without making a conclusion. Eli watched him trace the same boundary lines several times before finally asking for the brass plate. He carried it to the large table, matched its measurements against the survey, and then told everyone that the only way to settle the question was to leave the courthouse and inspect the original marker in the valley. The group drove out shortly afterward, with the surveyor carrying his equipment and several of the affected farmers following behind. At the sandstone marker, he cleared the remaining soil, positioned the brass plate against the original reference point, and took fresh bearings from the surrounding landmarks. The measurements aligned with the old survey almost perfectly. The creek bend was still where the survey said it should be, the surviving fence line confirmed the old boundary, and the spring channel followed the same route described in the maintenance records. The modern county map wasn't fraudulent. It was incomplete. The difference had developed gradually, as later property descriptions were prepared without anyone returning to the original survey or carrying forward the shared water easement. A boundary that once existed as part of a larger agricultural system had slowly been reduced to a simple property line on newer documents. The water channel remained physically present, but the history attached to it had almost disappeared from the official records. Calvin's attorneys argued that restoring the older interpretation would create complications for several pending land purchases. Their clients had already negotiated prices, signed agreements, and arranged financing based on the current property descriptions. If the shared easement remained enforceable, several transactions would have to be reconsidered. The county surveyor listened, then explained that inconvenience could not determine whether a recorded right existed. If the original survey and certification established the easement, later paperwork could not simply erase it because nobody had referred to the older document for decades. The hearing continued through the afternoon while the county reviewed the surviving records, the duplicate survey, the physical markers, and the maintenance history. Eli sat beside Ellis and watched farmers from across the valley wait quietly for the decision. Some had spent their entire lives believing the water arrangement was simply an old custom handed down by their parents. Now they were learning that their families had once held documented rights to something they had always assumed could never be taken away. Near the end of the afternoon, the county announced that the pending transfers involving the spring channel would be suspended while the historical easements were restored to the appropriate property records. The existing agricultural water access would remain protected, and the affected farms would not be treated as though the channel belonged exclusively to the old feed mill property. Ellis didn't celebrate. He simply closed the folder. Eli looked at the rusted document box sitting beside him and realized how close the valley had come to losing something nobody even knew it still possessed. If the safe had remained sealed, the documents might eventually have disappeared with the building. And if Henry Whitaker had never kept his father's duplicate, the original survey might never have been enough to establish what had been recorded. Outside the courthouse, Calvin stood beside his truck while the attorneys discussed the next steps. When he noticed Eli walking past, he stopped him. The confidence that had filled his voice at the auction was gone, replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. He asked Eli what had made him spend $40 on a safe that everyone else considered worthless. Eli explained that it wasn't the rust, the weight, or some belief that treasure had to be inside. He had noticed that the torch marks didn't make sense. Whoever had attacked the safe had stopped before reaching the inner chamber, and somebody had later gone to considerable trouble to seal that chamber even more securely. Eli told him that when someone quits cutting before reaching the place they were trying to reach, there is usually a reason. Calvin looked toward the courthouse, then back at the old document box in Eli's hands. For once, he didn't have a clever answer. The safe had never contained gold. It had contained something that mattered more to the people who had lived on that land for generations. Proof that the valley's water had never been meant to belong to one powerful owner. And the boy who had bought an 800-pound piece of rust for $40 had uncovered the evidence that allowed the people who had cared for that valley to keep what they had built together. Over the following months, the county restored the original shared water easement to the property records, and farmers across the valley began repairing sections of the neglected irrigation channel according to the maintenance records Samuel Harlan had left behind. The work was not dramatic, and nobody became wealthy because of it, but the effect was felt across hundreds of acres as water once again moved through channels that had been neglected for decades. The Mercer farm survived another difficult agricultural season, not because some sudden fortune erased its problems, but because the farmers who depended on the same spring-fed system no longer had to worry that forgotten paperwork would allow someone else to claim what their families had maintained together. Calvin Rusk continued buying farmland in other parts of the county, but he stopped treating old property records as worthless simply because they were old. Whenever a parcel came with handwritten surveys, faded deeds, or agricultural water agreements, he had his people examine them carefully before making an offer. He never publicly admitted that the rusted safe had changed the way he approached land acquisitions, but people who worked with him noticed the difference. Back at the Mercer workshop, Ellis spent several afternoons cleaning the safe. He removed loose flakes of rust, wiped away years of grime, and treated the exposed metal so the corrosion would stop spreading, but he deliberately left the old torch scars untouched. When Eli asked why, Ellis explained that those scars were part of the story because they showed where somebody had once tried to reach the hidden chamber and given up before discovering what the safe actually contained. The $40 auction receipt eventually went into a simple wooden frame beside the safe. It looked almost ridiculous hanging there beside the enormous piece of battered steel, but Ellis liked the contrast. The receipt showed exactly what everyone at the auction had believed the safe was worth, while everything that happened afterward showed how badly they had been mistaken. Years passed, and young farmers, mechanics, and people interested in old agricultural equipment began stopping by the workshop. Some came to have a tractor repaired, others brought broken pumps or worn farm machinery, and sooner or later somebody would notice the ugly safe sitting against the wall. They would ask why Ellis and Eli had kept it. Eli never started with the documents. He always pointed toward the damaged corner where the failed torch cut stopped short of the hidden chamber, because that was where the entire story had begun. He would explain that dozens of people had seen the same safe at the auction, examined the same rust, heard the same description from the auctioneer, and reached the same conclusion. To them, it was scrap metal. They simply stopped looking. Eli eventually became known across the county for restoring old farm machinery, especially equipment that other mechanics considered too outdated to justify repairing. People joked that he had inherited his grandfather's habit of saving things other people were ready to throw away, but Eli understood that the habit had never really been about saving everything. It was about understanding something before deciding what it was worth. One autumn afternoon, a teenage boy came into the workshop while waiting for his grandfather's tractor to finish being repaired. His attention went immediately to the safe, and after studying the rusted steel for a while, he asked Eli what had been inside. Eli smiled and told him that it wasn't what people expected. The boy guessed cash first, then gold, then silver, and Eli shook his head each time before explaining that the real treasure had been the documents hidden behind the chamber. They had preserved the history of a shared agricultural water system and helped protect the rights of 7 farming families whose land depended on it. The boy looked at the safe again and asked how much Eli had paid for it. Eli glanced toward the faded auction receipt hanging beside the steel door before answering that it had cost him $40. The entire auction had looked at the same rusted safe and seen scrap because everyone had already decided what it was worth. A 15-year-old farm boy had looked twice, noticed one detail that didn't fit the obvious explanation, and and followed that detail until it uncovered a piece of rural history capable of protecting hundreds of acres. Sometimes the difference between junk and something priceless isn't luck, wealth, or genius. Sometimes it is simply having enough patience to look twice after everyone else has already laughed and walked away. If you've ever seen something everyone else dismissed, only to discover there was more to it than anyone realized, tell us about it in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten farms, rural America, auctions, old machinery, hidden history, and the quiet people who notice what everyone else misses, subscribe to The Last Acre for the next story.